Welcome to Bhaskara Vision YouTube channel. Now, Professor Dr. V.H. Bhaskaran will deliver a talk on the function of criticism.
Good morning to all of you. We are now going to see in Principles of Literary Criticism what is the function of criticism according to classicism, neoclassicism, romanticism, Victorian criticism, arts for art's sake theory, new criticism, and the relationship between scholarship and criticism up to 20th century. Professor Garrett said once that literary criticism is literature suggested by a book. If literature is the outcome of the artist's creative impulse, criticism is an intellectual activity. The critic comes in to explain, to interpret, and to evaluate a creative work of art. The critic enables the reader to identify a work of art and puts it in a better setting so that the reader may understand better and appreciate it. He tries to articulate what remains silent in the process. Critics are the feelers of the society, and they become the spokesmen of public taste. The criticism of the Tudor and Elizabethan period was prescriptive. There is evidently a change in the function of criticism today. Literary criticism had its beginnings in ancient Greece. Plato examines poetry as a philosopher and moralist. Aristotle approaches poetry as a pure form of art without taking into account its influence on the state of citizens. In reply to Plato's charge that poets are liars, Aristotle says that poetry is not a copy but only an imitation. Horace, the earliest exponent of the classical school of criticism, suggests to the Romans to follow the models of Greek masters. Longinus holds the view that a work of art is an appropriate display of passion. When we come to Renaissance criticism, like Aristotle, Sir Philip Sidney wants poetry to teach and move. In his Apology for Poetry, Sidney, as the first poet critic in English, vindicates the superiority of poetry over other branches of knowledge and starts the English tradition of descriptive criticism. Ben Jonson's judgment on Shakespeare and Spenser shows that criticism was judgment then. When you look into neoclassic criticism, the neoclassicists from the middle of the 17th century till almost the end of 18th century accepted the classicists as their models. Dryden starts comparative criticism in English and makes criticism as respectable as literature. He educates his readers in the skills of responding to works of art. Pope's essay on criticism embodies a significant synthesis of the evolving new classical doctrine. Dr. Johnson, a man of robust common sense and the first biocritic in English literature, insists on the moral responsibility of the poet to society. He believes that poetry, though written by exceptional people, is essentially intended for the common man. Deviating from the path of the neoclassicist, the romantics say that poetry is born of imagination and the critic's function is to reveal the creative process. Modern critics often turn to Coleridge, a theorist, because of the interest he shows in what happens in the poet's mind. In Victorian age, to Matthew Arnold, poetry is a criticism of life. It should have high seriousness. Arnold's The Study of Poetry is one of the cardinal documents of literary criticism. His critical concepts of grand style, dignified subject, and the limitations of verse translations are of great value. The aesthetic movement was a reaction to Arnold's neoclassical idealism and socio-realistic propagandism generated in Germany. The advocates of art for art's sake theory aimed at the experience itself and not the fruit of experience. Oscar Wilde, the aesthetic critic, was guided by his sensibility and personal impressions in criticizing a work of art. Northrop Frye considered his age as the golden age of anti-critical criticism. In the beginning of 20th century, scholarship and criticism were considered as each other's antithesis. The scholastic criticism of A.C. Bradley, Oliver Elton, and Walter Raleigh does not go a long way in germinating the seeds of criticism of immediate future. The new critics reacted violently against academic criticism. Eliot propounded a new theory that his criticism is a byproduct of his private poetry workshop. According to Eliot, a poet just assists the fusion of emotions and feeling in a poem. Creative process involves a lot of critical labor, a frightful toil of sifting, combining, constructing, correcting, and testing. It as much as critical as creative, says T.S. Eliot, who educated the sensibility of his readers. Eliot used high-sounding jargons, objective correlative, depersonalization, autotechnic, lemon squeezing, and poetry workshop. I.A. Richards, with his scientific approach, gives a very new turn to literary criticism. His theory of synesthesis is an outcome of his interest in psychology. He does not like to look upon a poem as a capsule containing some fixed meaning. F.R. Lewis does not associate himself with any school other than his own, and he belongs to the one-man school. In his opinion, criticism is the effective application of intelligence in literature. Abercrombie assigns to the critic the job of taking the reader to the house beautiful, removing the impediments on the way. He cannot aspire to be the interpreter of house beautiful. John Crowe Ransom, who spearheads new criticism, holds a view that the artists, the philosophers, and the university professors are the three kinds of trained performers who have competence for criticism. Criticism should be objective, according to him. He says that the important components of a poem are logical structure and logical texture. He firmly believes that nothing can be more interesting, nothing can be more stimulating to critical analysis than comparative literature. There must be a harmonious blending of scholarship and criticism in a critic's personality. A scholar may not be a good critic, but a critic has to be a scholar. Eliot insists on the critics possessing a very highly developed sense of fact. Quoting F.R. Lewis is an example. Bateson says that a scholar critic is a blending of the two aspects of a single discipline. As a representative of the Arnoldian tradition, Bateson says that new criticism is irresponsible criticism. The new criticism concentrates on form. Emerson lays emphasis on ambiguities and Clark Brooks on irony and paradox in poems. The new critics concentrate exclusively on the work of art and discard all considerations of the circumstances of its creation. The technique of the new critics works well with short pieces, but the new critics fight shy of long poems. Pointing out the limitation of the new critics and their critical monism, Horace Crane, Olson, and Keast seek to revive the need for respecting literary genres. Northrop Frye considers academic criticism a structure of knowledge, and the academic critic's duty is not to inflate or deflate the reputation of a writer. Helen Gardner believes that a good critic carries a torch. According to her, the duty of a critic is to assist the reader to read for himself, not to read for him. Susan Sontag is dead against interpretation because she says interpretation poisons the reader's sensibilities and the interpretation is the revenge of intellect upon art. To sum up, all readers do not have a common standard and many may not respond to a work of art. When the work of art is obscure, the reader turns to the critic. A critic's contribution is important as it contributes to a consolidating structure of knowledge. Good taste leads to value judgment. But the difficulty is value judgments cannot be demonstrated. A critic who contributes to the total body of criticism of which he is a part, according to Frye, leads us to Arnoldian culture. To Horace Crane, literary criticism is not a single discipline. Criticism primarily aims at forming and cultivating taste for values and educating the reader's sensibility, paving way for new literature. The impact of criticism may not be felt easily and immediately because it's a slow process. Its cumulative effect pervades all through imperceptibly. We have just seen a brief history of the function of criticism up to 20th century.